Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earlier crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. Today I am using the new Honeybee Stamps Everything Beautiful stamp set. This is a Kelly Taylor design. She draws the prettiest florals, and I love her videos, so I cannot help but buy her stamps. I did purchase the coordinating die set. I'm going to be using a piece of pattern paper out of this Paper Studios paper stack from Hobby Lobby, and I will be using a color palette that I found in the Sarah Renee Clark color cubes. This is the color palette I'm using. This is card number 391. I have been eyeballing these color cubes forever, since the very first time I saw them, and I finally broke down and bought them. So I've collected an assortment of Copic markers to mimic that color palette that I saw. I am going to do a little bit of changing up of some of those colors. I will be stamping in Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink onto Nina Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I do end up changing out that kind of yellowish gold for a brighter yellow. It was too muted for the other colors that I chose. And I think that's all of the coloring. So let's go ahead and jump on into our crime. Our alphabetical journey today takes us to Minnesota. Now, Minnesota, or the area that became Minnesota, was the plentiful home to Native American tribes and even the French trappers they traded with until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. After the U.S. acquired the land with the Louisiana Purchase, the westward movement kind of created a new frontier. So there were more people living amongst the trappers and the Native American tribes. Eventually, Minnesota was called the New England of the West because of the rapidly increasing numbers of settlers moving there. The German and Scandinavian immigrants would come to Minnesota looking for better jobs and better opportunities. And there were some higher concentration of Irish immigrants due to the political and religious turmoil and the economic downturn that was going on in Ireland in the 1800s. So that's actually a key factor in our story today. So Minnesota was actually part of the Missouri Territory until 1821, and then it was like this unorganized parcel of land. And in 1834, it was part of the Wisconsin Territory, and then in 1846, it became its own territory. And the borders are about what they are today, with the exception of the inclusion of what became North and South Dakota. So after some border turmoil and political maneuvering, Minnesota became the 32nd state of the Union on May 11, 1858. So Minnesota may be home of the 10,000 lakes, but there are actually more than 14,000 named lakes that are at least 10 acres large in size, which comes in handy since Ralph Samuelson of Lake City invented the sport of water skiing. Minnesota is home to 3M, where Post-its were created. There is also a 60-foot tall magnetic rock situated or located in northern Minnesota. You have to drive through Canada or go across a lake to get to part of Minnesota. Minnesota produces around 40 million turkeys annually. And if you like Spam, think Minnesota, because Minnesota is home to the Hormel Company, creators of Spam. There are more gray wolves that live in Minnesota than any other of the lower 48 states, the continuous 48 states. And there are 2 Nobel Prize winners from Minnesota. No causation, just correlation. Fargo is not in Minnesota, but Fort Snelling was. And that is the middle of the beginning of our story today, the story of money, land, and shenanigans. So let's start in the middle today because background is necessary. As the westward expansion increased, there was a need to safeguard the citizens and the land claimed by the U.S. and its territories, thus the creation of military forts. Fort Snelling was one of those said forts. It was located on the bluffs overlooking where the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers connected. The confluence, I think, is the word. And the military site, though, was actually named Fort St. Anthony and then was renamed Fort Snelling once its construction was completed in about 1825. Now, Fort Snelling is probably most famous for allowing those who were stationed there to bring slaves with them. And two of the most famous slaves that lived there are probably Dred and Harriet Scott. Their case for freedom went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, wow, words are hard, setting a national precedent. The land that Fort Snelling was built on was land acquired by Zebulon Pike in what became known as Pike's Purchase. And it was a vague treaty with Native American tribes that left the actual purchase price of the land up to Congress and what they valued it at. And that is a very simplified story of that. If you want more, Google Pike's Purchase. So, after the War of 1812, Fort Snelling became home to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Leavenworth, who was the commander of the 5th Expeditionary Infantry Force. They were charged with building up the fort so that it could become the garrison for a larger group of military personnel as they were attempting to enter into treaties with the Dakota tribe and a couple of the other local Native American tribes that inhabited the areas west. Fun side note, Fort Snelling has the record for the longest continuous weather record kept in the United States. Just fun fact. Now, there were many other notable military officers that took command of the fort during its history, but today we're going to concentrate on one particular historical point involving the military and its discharged members. So going back to the beginning, we're going to meet a man named Edward Phelan, I think is how you say his name, Phelan. Edward was born in Ireland about 1811 and eventually immigrated to the United States. As I mentioned before, there was a lot of political turmoil happening in Ireland at this time. There was a wedge between the English Irish and the Scottish Irish, and that was compounded or aggravated by famine and just a generally bad economy. And I'm supposing that is what brought Edward to the United States. Census records indicate that he arrived, immigration records indicate that he arrived in the United States on June 8, 1835. So he's about 24. Now, he arrived in New York City, and once he got to the United States, he enlisted in the Army and was shipped off to, you guessed it, Fort Snelling, Minnesota. Wow, words today. Sorry, y'all. Anyway, one military record described Edward as having, quote, gray eyes, brown hair, fair complexion, and was 6 feet 2 1/2 inches tall, end quote. He was also known to have a bad reputation, especially amongst his fellow soldiers, and he was labeled a bully and was known to have a hot temper. Now, about this time in the U.S. history, there was a land claim project going on in large portions of the western frontier. The idea was that if you could get to a specific place with a small amount of money or smaller than average amount of money, you could buy a tract of land from the federal government to make into your homestead. These land claims were created after the United States federal government entered into treaties with Native American tribes for the purchase of lands. So by about 1838, Edward was being discharged from the Army. His reason for discharge was expiration of service. So he did his time. He fulfilled his contract, and he was not interested in reenlisting, or the Army was not interested in keeping him, one or the other, or both. Edward had this grand plan because the federal government at that time had land claims in the Minnesota Territory, and Edward wanted one. There was just one problem. He didn't have any money. Ever the resourceful individual, Edward approached his friend and fellow soldier John Hayes. You see, John had money, but he still had at least a year left on his Army contract. So their great plan was that Edward would go to the land claim office and claim 2 tracts of land purchased with John's money. Edward would then work both his and John's land tract until John was separated from the military and was able to come and work his own land. And it was a beautiful plan, and it was a successful plan. The 2 tracts of land cover nearly all of modern downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. So Edward settled along a creek that flowed between a lake that became known as Phelan Lake and the Mississippi River. He created a successful cattle ranch and farm, and eventually took on a series of claims around St. Paul and moved into a cabin about a mile away from any other settlers. So a year or so after Edward has purchased these land tracts, John has finished his enlistment and is ready to take over working the land that Edward had been safeguarding for him. Now, it was reported in a couple of sources that these two were a really odd pair of friends. Edward was uneducated, crude, and had some kind of a criminal past that I could not find other information on. John was the opposite. He was affable. He could get along with anybody. He was nicer. So it was probably no surprise to those living in the area that once John arrived on his land, these 2 men argued a lot. Neighbors could not understand how they continued to buy land together to build working farms and be successful and fight so much. They fought in public. They didn't care who saw, who heard, or anything about it. They just argued wherever the argument creeped in. Then, in September of 1839, John disappeared. 3 weeks later, John's body was discovered badly beaten near Carver's Cave in St. Paul. Guess who was an early suspect? Did you guess Edward? 'Cause you'd be right if you did. So a man named Harry Sibley, who coincidentally went on to be the first governor of the state of Minnesota, was called to investigate the case because he was currently the justice of the peace, or a justice of the peace. Within weeks of this investigation beginning, Edward was arrested. He was tried for murder and not convicted. After his release, Edward returned to claim both him and John's farms. But upon his arrival, he found that his neighbors wanted nothing to do with him. They wanted to be around him even less than they had before. And John's farm had actually been, the claim had been taken over by a French-Canadian settler in the 6 months between John's disappearance and death and Edward's return to the area. Not to be defeated, though, Edward sold that tract of land and moved farther east. He claimed a new piece of land near what is now called Swede Hollow, where the now named Phelan Creek meets the Mississippi River. And again, he grew what became a successful farm and cattle ranch. And he continued to grow his farm and his wealth, and eventually his name re-entered the history books again in 1848. You see, Edward became one of the delegates at the Stillwater Convention, the convention that was convened to direct Minnesota's path toward statehood. However, as influential as Edward was, he could not escape the shadow of guilt. Even when a report surfaced that a warrior from one of the Native American tribes made a deathbed confession to John's murder, the locals in the area, or many of the locals in the area, believed that Edward was actually the one responsible. They did not believe this deathbed confession. And then, in 1850, Edward died. And his death is an entire separate mystery. You see, the record was only briefly written by a man named Fletcher Williams in 1876. In the 1870s, Fletcher was beginning to write the history of St. Paul. And in his history, he wrote that Edward fled west to California to escape a perjury charge. And on that journey, he was killed by traveling companions who claimed self-defense. And then Fletcher added no other details to his history. And if you've been here for any of my other true crime stories, you're probably wondering, why did I choose this weird, unsolved, very little detail story? Well, here's where it gets interesting. You see, like I mentioned, in as early as 1870, people began to write the history of St. Paul and the area around it. And one of the things they were specifically writing about was the impact Edward had had on the area. Remember, he purchased a lot of the land that is now downtown St. Paul. He is the initial person who created that livable space out of wilderness. But as the investigation into Edward's influence in the area began, things were looking kind of fishy. Court records that were less than 20 years old were missing, gone. And those missing records left a hole in the history of Minnesota until the 1990s, when author Gary Brugman, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, began researching his book titled Minnesota's Oldest Murder Mystery. Upon searching the Minnesota Historical Society archives, Gary came across some interesting information. In the papers of Joseph R. Brown, one of the state's founding fathers, on top of the very first box he opened was a court ledger. Want to guess which court ledger? You got it. See, Henry Sibley, the justice of the peace who had been charged with investigating the murder of John, actually had passed it off to Joseph Brown because of some kind of jurisdictional issue. Joseph tried the case and had taken meticulous notes, including the testimony of 12 witnesses, as well as 2 separate but conflicting accounts from Edward himself. Now, I did not read Gary's entire book. I read excerpts of it that were on a blog source that I will link down below. But according to Gary, the accounts that he found tell the story this way. John went missing in September, but it was Edward who reported him missing. Edward raised the first alarm. He claimed that John had gone off searching for a missing calf that he suspected had been stolen by a Native American tribe passing through. Edward himself organized a search party for John, but here's where his story seems to kind of fall flat. Edward claimed that he had canoed John across the river to confront the thieves at a nearby village. But a neighbor who went on the search party reported there were no footprints where the canoe would have or should have landed. 3 weeks later, a group of traveling Native Americans visiting Fort Snelling told soldiers they'd seen the body of a white man near what is now called Dayton's Bluff. So a military doctor and several soldiers went to investigate, and when they got there, Edward was already there. Okay, weird, but not necessarily incriminating, right? He's following his own trail, I suppose, whatever. But according to the records that described John's death and murder, he was brutally beaten. His head was bashed in, his jaw was broken. And the phrase we use now would be bloody pulp. I mean, he was badly beaten. When he was tried for John's murder, Edward did nothing to help himself. Gary recorded that his testimonies were contradictory and full of self-incrimination and full of lies. In Gary's estimation, and this is a quote from him, "If your partner disappears and you're totally innocent, why would you lie?" And it is believed that John's remains were actually buried where they were found, there near Dayton's Bluff. Now, the one thing that was not expanded upon was Edward's death or his murder. Now, again, I haven't read Gary's entire book, but what in the heck happened to Edward? I mean, Why was he running from a perjury charge? Did it have something to do with John's murder trial? And why in the world would his traveling companions have killed him? And if there's more of them than him, how could it be self-defense? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. But even after being implicated in the murder of his friend, neighbor, and business partner, Edward's impact on the St. Paul area was real. There's a lake named after him. There's a river named after him. But the stink of murder never left him. Now, if you've been here before, you know I like these stories because I like to play Monday morning quarterback, right? I like to play crime detective from the luxury of my house and, 2024. But here is what caught my attention on this story. Here you have a man who was instrumental in the development of St. Paul, Minnesota, arguably one of the more known names of cities in the state. He was not a likable human being by most accounts. And he managed to maintain a friendship, albeit a friendship out of necessity, with a man who was very likable. But he also was a successful businessman. Like, he made this land tract program through the government work for him. And the details of his trial go hidden for, more than 100 years. Yeah, that seems suspicious to me. I think that somebody else had a reason to bury those court records. That's just how my brain works. Unfortunately, I could not find a picture of either Edward or John. I did find some drawings of the area that they had grown, but that's it. So thanks for hanging out with me today. I know it was short but sweet. I have a couple of other videos here for you to watch. I've also added that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below and tell me your suspicions. Give me a thumbs up if you liked the video, and have a really fabulous day.